The solitary ridge offered a perfect refuge from the loud men and cruel realities of the world below. Yet, bracing himself for tears when a trembling girl was shoved toward him at the trading post, the mountain man entirely forgot how to breathe as her small fingers confidently wrapped around his calloused palm instead. Mud was the only constant in Cooper's Crossing. It sucked at the boots of prospectors, swallowed wagon wheels, and coated the hem of every skirt that dared touch the boardwalk. Gideon hated the town. He came down from the high country twice a year, strictly for coffee, salt, and black powder. He preferred the silent judgment of timber wolves to the constant, grasping desperation of men. He stood at the counter of Cooper's Mercantile, trading a stack of prime beaver pelts. The air smelled of stale tobacco, spilled whiskey, and wet wool. That was when the shouting started near the door. "I owe you $50, Boyd. Not the girl. The girl ain't part of it." Gideon didn't turn around. It wasn't his business. He ran a thumb over a heavy box of rifle cartridges, checking the brass. But the voices climbed higher, sharp and ugly. "You ain't got $50, Jeb," a rougher voice answered. Boyd, a local claim jumper who smelled of sulfur and bad intentions. "The bank's taking your lot, but the girl? I'll forgive the debt, and I'll give you 20 in coin. You walk away." Gideon finally looked. Uncle Jeb, a hollowed-out man with a whiskey-ruined face, was gripping the edge of a flour barrel. Beside him stood a girl. Her name was Clara. Gideon didn't know that yet. All he saw was a worn, homespun dress, too thin for the encroaching October chill, and a face completely stripped of color. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing that caught his eye. Most women in her position being haggled over like a mule would be sobbing. Clara just stared straight ahead, her jaw locked. Her hands were folded in front of her, knuckles white. She was young, but her eyes were old. "She's my brother's girl," Jeb muttered, the fight draining out of him. He was looking at the $20 gold piece Boyd was rolling across his knuckles. "It ain't right." "Ain't nothing out here, right?" Boyd sneered. He reached out and grabbed Clara by the upper arm. Gideon's jaw tightened. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who lived at 9,000 feet because he wanted to be left alone. He turned back to the counter, pushed his supplies into a burlap sack, and picked it up. He told himself to walk out the side door. Instead, he found his boots carrying him toward the front. "Let her go." The words were quiet, barely a rumble, but they cut through the ambient noise of the Mercantile like a snapped wagon axle. Boyd looked up, his eyes narrowing. He took in Gideon's massive frame, the heavy bear-hide coat, the scarred leather of his holster, and the dead-level stare. "This ain't your business, mountain man." Gideon reached into his pocket. He pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with gold dust he'd panned from the upper forks of the Snake River. He tossed it onto the barrel. It hit the wood with a heavy, final thud. "There's $80 there," Gideon said. His voice was flat. "The debt is paid. The girl comes with me." Boyd looked at the pouch, then at Gideon's hand hovering an inch from his Colt. He let go of Clara's arm, grabbed the pouch, and spat on the floor. "She's your problem now. Good luck feeding her." He shoved past them and out the door. Jeb stood there, trembling. I appreciate it, mister. I do. But she needs a provider. She ain't got nothing. No dowry. No standing. If you're taking her, you ought to make it legal. The magistrate is sitting at the saloon right now. You sign the paper, she's yours. Safe from Boyd for good. Gideon looked at the uncle with deep disgust. I bought her freedom. I didn't buy a wife. She stays here. Boyd will find her when you ride out, Jeb insisted, his voice rising in panic. Please, accept her. She's a quiet one, a virgin, biddable. Just sign the paper. Gideon finally looked directly at Clara. She met his gaze. There was no gratitude in her eyes, just a cold, hard assessment of a new reality. She was sizing him up the same way he sized up a winter storm. Get the magistrate, Gideon said. 10 minutes later, on the sticky bar of the local saloon, a piece of paper was signed. Gideon scratched his name. Clara signed hers in neat, precise script. They were legally bound. A bargain struck at the edge of the world. Gideon walked out, loading his supplies onto his pack mule. "I'll drop you at the stagecoach station in Cheyenne in the spring," he told her over his shoulder. "Till then, you stay out of my way." Clara grabbed her single, battered carpet bag. "Yes, sir." Her voice was gravel and dust. He didn't look back to see her shivering. He just started walking toward the tree line. The trail up to the ridge wasn't meant for people. It was an elk run, steep and rutted, choked with scree and fallen timber. Gideon led the mule. He set a brutal pace. It wasn't intentional malice. It was simply the speed he walked, the speed required to beat the dying sun. He half expected Clara to beg him to slow down within the first hour. He waited for the complaints about her boots, which were little more than hardened leather slippers meant for church pews, not jagged granite. The complaints never came. 3 hours into the climb, the elevation began to steal the air. The wind whipped through the pines, carrying the sharp, metallic bite of impending snow. Gideon paused to check the mule's cinch. He looked back. Clara was 30 yards behind. Her face was flushed, her chest heaving. She was using a dead branch as a walking stick. She stopped when he stopped. She didn't sit down. She just stood there, leaning heavily on the wood, staring at him. "It gets steeper," he called out. His voice was rougher than he intended. "Then I suggest we keep moving," she called back. Gideon turned and grabbed the lead rope. Stubborn. He could respect stubborn. By nightfall, they reached the halfway point, a shallow cave overhang that offered a windbreak. Gideon tied off the mule, built a small fire from dry deadfall, and set a tin pot of water to boil. He threw down a heavy canvas tarp near the flames. "Sit," he commanded. Clara practically collapsed onto the canvas. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her thin arms around her legs to conserve heat. In the firelight, Gideon saw the mud caked to her shins. He also saw the dark, wet stains seeping through the sides of her ruined boots. Blood. He dug into his pack and pulled out a jar of pine pitch salve and a strip of clean cotton. He tossed them across the fire. They landed in her lap. "Fix your feet," he said, turning his back to her to stir the coffee. "We walk another 10 miles tomorrow." He heard the rustle of fabric, the quiet hiss of a sharp breath as she peeled the leather away from her blistered skin. He didn't turn around. He poured black coffee into a tin cup, scraped some beans onto an iron plate, and set it on the edge of her canvas. "Eat." "Thank you." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, packed tight with everything they weren't saying. Gideon sat cross-legged on the dirt, drinking his coffee, watching the fire. Most women brought to the mountain tried to fill the quiet. They chattered out of fear, or they wept. Clara did neither. She existed in the silence as if it was her natural element. "Why didn't you fight him?" Gideon asked suddenly. He hadn't meant to speak. The mountain usually cured him of questions. Clara stopped chewing a hard piece of biscuit. She looked at him through the dancing flames. "My uncle?" "Boit," she swallowed. "Screaming wastes energy. It doesn't change the minds of men like that. It only makes them enjoy it more." Gideon absorbed that. It was a bleak truth, spoken by someone who had clearly learned it the hard way. "And me?" he asked. "Why didn't you fight coming with me?" Clara looked down at her hands. "You paid $80. You bought my life. And you didn't look at me like I was a piece of meat." She paused, her voice dropping. "You looked at me like I was a piece of furniture. I can survive being furniture." Gideon stared at her. He wanted to tell her she wasn't furniture. He wanted to tell her he didn't own her. But the words tangled in his throat. He just grunted, pulled his hat down over his eyes, and lay back against his saddle. "Sleep," he muttered. "Sun comes up early." The next day was harder. The snow started falling at noon. Fat, wet flakes that stuck to their clothes and turned the rocks to ice. Clara slipped twice. The first time, she caught herself on a boulder, tearing the sleeve of her dress. The second time, she went down hard on her knees. Gideon stopped. He walked back to her. He didn't offer his hand. He just waited. Clara pushed herself up out of the slush. Her hands were raw, scraped bloody by the ice. She didn't look at him. She just picked up her makeshift walking stick and stepped around him, taking the lead for exactly 3 steps before her pace slowed. Gideon fell in behind her. He watched the rigid line of her back. She was terrified. She was freezing. She was bleeding. But she was not breaking. When the cabin finally broke through the tree line, it was nearly dark. It was a brutal, square structure built of massive, unpeeled pine logs. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney Gideon had banked the coals before he left. Clara stopped in the clearing, staring at it. It was completely isolated, miles from another human soul. A prison or a sanctuary, depending on the man who held the key. Gideon walked past her, pushed the heavy door open, and struck a match to light an oil lamp. "Get inside," he said. She crossed the threshold. The ascent was over. The real test was about to begin. The cabin was small, a single room. A heavy cast iron stove dominated the center, radiating a faint, residual heat. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars of preserved meat and dried apples, and in the corner, a single bed. It was built into the wall, layered with thick elk hides and a heavy quilt. Clara stood in the center of the room, dripping melting snow onto the floorboards. She looked at the bed, then at Gideon. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Gideon shucked off his heavy coat and hung it on a peg. He walked to the stove, throwing in 3 logs from the wood box. The fire roared to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. "You take the bed," he said, not looking at her. He pointed to a small ladder leading up to a loft built beneath the rafters. "I sleep up there. My gear is up there." Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 2 days. Her shoulders dropped an inch. "Thank you, Mr. Gideon," he interrupted. "Just Gideon." "Thank you, Gideon." The first week passed in a strange, tightly wound routine. Gideon was gone before she woke, running his trap lines, chopping wood, hunting. He came back at dusk. Clara, true to her word, stayed out of his way. But she didn't stay idle. Gideon began noticing the small things. The cast iron skillets, usually caked with old grease, were scrubbed clean with river sand. His spare shirts, which had been tossed over a chair, were folded neatly on his shelf. The cabin smelled less like wet dog and old smoke, and more like pine needles and boiling oats. She was nesting. In a place she was only meant to survive until spring, she was carving out a space. They barely spoke. They operated in an intricate dance of avoidance. He would step left when she stepped right. If they reached for the coffee pot at the same time, Gideon would pull his hand back as if burned, letting her pour first. He was terrified of frightening her. She was terrified of angering him. Then came the storm. It hit on a Tuesday afternoon. The wind screamed off the ridge, tearing at the shingles and rattling the heavy door. The temperature plummeted so fast the sap froze and popped in the trees outside like musket fire. Gideon was forced inside early. He sat by the fire, working on a damaged beaver trap. The spring mechanism was rusted tight, and he was trying to pry it open with a heavy iron file. Clara was sitting at the table, mending the torn sleeve of her dress by the light of the oil lamp. The silence was normal, but the confinement made it hum with tension. Gideon gripped the trap with his left hand, forcing the file against the metal catch with his right. He pushed hard, too hard. The rusted metal gave way instantly. The spring snapped shut with vicious force. The heavy iron jaw caught the webbing between Gideon's thumb and forefinger, slicing deep into the flesh before he could yank his hand away. He didn't scream, but a low, guttural hiss escaped his teeth. He dropped the trap onto the floorboards with a heavy clatter and grabbed his bleeding hand, squeezing it tight against his chest. Blood welled up instantly, thick and dark, dripping onto his trousers. "Damn it," he muttered, turning away from Clara. He didn't want her to see it. He didn't want the fuss or the panic. He walked to the wash basin, grabbing a dirty rag to press against the wound. It was a bad cut. Deep. It was going to need stitches, or at least a tight bind to stop the bleeding. He fumbled with the rag one-handed, swearing under his breath as the blood soaked through the fabric. "Let me." The voice was quiet, right by his elbow. Gideon jumped. He hadn't heard her move. Clara was standing there, holding a clean strip of boiled cotton she had torn from an old flour sack. Beside her, on the counter, she had already poured a bowl of hot water from the kettle. "I got it," Gideon growled, turning his shoulder to block her out. "It's fine. You are bleeding on the floor," she said, her tone perfectly even. "And you only have one good hand. Let me." He hesitated. He hated being vulnerable. He hated needing help. But the blood was pooling, and he knew she was right. Slowly, he lowered his hand and held it out over the basin. Clara stepped in. She took the dirty rag from him and tossed it aside. She dipped another cloth into the hot water. Then, she took his hand. Gideon braced himself. He expected her to flinch. His hands were massive, scarred by knives and rope burns, calloused, thick as leather. They were violent hands, rough hands. He expected her delicate fingers to graze him with terror, treating him like a wild animal that might bite. Instead, Clara's hand wrapped around his wrist. Her grip was firm, solid. There was no hesitation. She didn't hover. She took the weight of his heavy arm into her own hands and held it steady over the basin. Gideon froze. It wasn't just the firmness of her touch. It was the absolute startling lack of fear. She pressed the hot, wet cloth directly against the open wound. It burned like fire, but Gideon didn't pull away. He couldn't move. He looked down at her hands holding his. Her skin was rougher than he realized, reddened by the lye soap she'd been using to clean his pots, blistered from the climb. But the way her fingers locked around his palm, it felt impossible. She held his hand like she already knew him. She held it the way an anchor holds a ship, not with romance, but with an absolute, undeniable certainty. It was a grounding force. In a life where Gideon had only ever experienced touch as a prelude to violence or a transactional exchange, this touch was entirely different. It was an acceptance. "This will sting," she murmured. She reached for a small bottle of whiskey on the shelf, uncorked it with her teeth, and poured a splash over the raw cut. Gideon's jaw locked. The muscles in his forearm corded like iron cables. But he didn't pull away. He kept his eyes fixed on the top of her head. He watched the way the lamplight caught the stray strands of her brown hair. He watched the intense focus in her eyes as she quickly and efficiently wrapped the clean cotton around his hand, pulling it tight to staunch the flow. "You've done this before," he said, his voice raspy, barely audible over the howling wind outside. Clara tied off the bandage with a sharp, practiced knot. She didn't let go of his hand immediately. She smoothed her thumb over the uninjured back of his knuckles, wiping away a smear of half-dried blood. "My father was a logger," she said quietly, her eyes still on his hand. "Before he died, before Uncle Jeb took me in, I spent a lot of time putting men back together." She finally looked up. She was standing inches from him. For the first time since they met, she didn't drop her gaze. She looked right into his eyes. "You don't have to hide from me, Gideon." The words hit him harder than a physical blow. He realized, in that split second, that he had spent the entire week hiding. Not just physically retreating to the loft, but hiding his true nature, hiding his fear of ruining her, hiding his desperate, hollow loneliness behind a wall of gruff silence. He swallowed hard. His throat felt thick. He looked at his bandaged hand, still resting in hers. "I ain't used to," he started, then stopped. He didn't know how to finish the sentence. "I ain't used to kindness. I ain't used to someone staying. I ain't used to this." Clara gently released his hand. She picked up the bloody water basin. "None of us are used to the things that save us," she said. She turned and carried the basin to the door to dump it into the snow. Gideon stood by the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs. The throbbing pain in his hand was nothing compared to the sudden, terrifying shift in his chest. The ice around his solitary life had cracked. She wasn't a fragile, broken bird. She was steel forged in a different kind of fire. And as he watched her walk back to the table, sit down, and pick up her mending as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis, the mountain man realized he was in profound trouble. He didn't want to take her to the stagecoach in the spring. Winter did not just arrive on the ridge, it laid siege. By December, the snowdrift swallowed the lower half of the cabin walls. The world outside shrank to a blinding white expanse, hostile and utterly silent, save for the shrieking wind that tore through the pines. The heavy logs of the cabin groaned under the weight of the ice. Inside, the space was reduced to the 10 square feet surrounding the cast iron stove. They settled into a rhythm dictated entirely by survival. Gideon taught her the mountain. He showed her how to stretch and scrape the rabbit hides, how to render animal fat down for tallow candles, and how to pack the snow tightly against the cabin's base for added insulation. He also taught her how to shoot. "You don't pull the trigger," he told her one brutal gray afternoon, handing her the heavy Winchester rifle. "You squeeze it, like you're wringing out a cloth, slowly." Clara stood on the small patch of cleared earth near the woodpile, shivering despite the heavy wool coat Gideon had draped over her shoulders. She raised the stock to her shoulder. It was too long for her, heavy and awkward. Gideon stepped behind her. He didn't touch her, but his massive frame blocked the biting wind. "Breathe in," his voice rumbled right beside her ear. "Let half of it out. Hold it. Now squeeze." The rifle barked, a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the granite walls. The recoil punched Clara's shoulder hard enough to knock her back a half step. Gideon caught her elbow, steadying her. 50 yards away, a thick icicle hanging from a dead pine branch shattered into powder. Clara lowered the gun, rubbing her collarbone. She didn't complain about the bruise he knew was already forming. She just handed the rifle back. "Good," Gideon said. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. "For wolves?" she asked, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "For anything that comes up that trail looking for trouble," he replied, his eyes scanning the tree line. He wasn't just talking about animals. They both knew it. The shift between them was glacial, but absolute. The terrified, hollow-eyed girl from Cooper's Crossing was gone. In her place was a woman who smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, whose hands were growing thick with calluses, and who no longer flinched when Gideon moved suddenly. They were two solitary creatures trapped in a cage of ice, slowly learning that the other wasn't going to bite. The silence between them lost its tension. It became comfortable, a shared blanket. Then came February, and with it, the fever. It started as a dry, rattling hack deep in Gideon's chest. He ignored it. He spent 3 days checking the far trap lines in waist-deep snow, breathing in air so cold it felt like inhaled glass. On the 4th day, he walked through the cabin door, dropped